If you value in-depth historical analysis that goes beyond familiar battle maps and slogans, subscribe to the Survival Record. This channel exists for people who want to understand how wars were actually lived and survived by civilians. One of the least discussed realities of World War II is that many civilian deaths were not the result of a single bomb, raid, or execution order, but of decisions made weeks or months earlier, based on assumptions that had once been reasonable and suddenly became fatal. Families did not die because they were careless or ignorant. They died because the rules of survival changed faster than human habits, institutions, and beliefs could adapt. This documentary examines 7 survival mistakes that repeatedly proved deadly across Europe and Asia, not to assign blame, but to understand how ordinary people misread danger in an unprecedented war. And, what those misjudgments still teach us. Many families waited for official evacuation orders that were never meant to save everyone. In multiple countries, civilians trusted that governments would issue evacuation orders when danger became truly imminent. In reality, evacuation planning during World War II was shaped as much by labor needs, transportation limits, and morale concerns as by civilian safety. In Nazi-occupied Eastern Europe, authorities often delayed evacuations because factories, farms, and rail lines depended on civilian labor. In Britain, early evacuation programs prioritized children, not entire households, leaving parents behind in bomb-prone cities. In Japan, mass civilian evacuations from urban centers were implemented late, even as incendiary bombing made wooden housing catastrophically vulnerable. Families who waited for formal instructions often found themselves trapped by rapidly changing front lines or overwhelmed infrastructure. By the time evacuation orders came, roads were impassable, trains were requisitioned for military use, or borders were sealed. Post-war civil defense doctrine increasingly emphasized early voluntary evacuation and decentralized decision-making, precisely because World War II demonstrated that centralized orders often came too late to be life-saving. Staying in familiar homes felt safer than fleeing into uncertainty until it wasn't. For many civilians, the instinct to remain in their homes was rooted in logic, not denial. Homes represented shelter, food stores, tools, and social networks. Leaving meant exposure, hunger, and the risk of violence on the road. In Eastern Europe, families who fled early were sometimes robbed, conscripted, or separated permanently. These experiences reinforced the belief that staying put was safer. However, as front lines hardened into zones of annihilation warfare, familiarity became a liability. Urban areas became targets not because of who lived there, but because of infrastructure density. Rural villages were destroyed as anti-partisan measures. Civilians who stayed often found that their homes marked them for forced labor, reprisals, or starvation sieges. Modern disaster preparedness theory draws directly from these outcomes, stressing mobility planning and pre-identified fallback locations rather than emotional attachment to fixed structures. Many civilians, really underestimated just how quickly food systems could collapse. Pre-war Europe and Asia still had living memories of hardship. But World War II introduced systemic agricultural breakdown on a scale that, honestly, very few people anticipated. Occupation policies routinely stripped entire regions of their surplus food. Transportation networks, they just failed under constant bombing. What started as seasonal shortages soon became, more or less, permanent deficits. Families who relied on markets or ration systems without developing some kind of independent food strategy were among the very first to suffer. In besieged cities like Leningrad, Warsaw, and Manila, civilian survival increasingly depended on early adaptation, growing food in non-traditional spaces, preserving supplies as aggressively as possible, and trading skills rather than currency. Those who waited for rations to normalize sadly often starved before systems ever recovered. The war directly influenced post-war survival doctrine, emphasizing food redundancy, preservation knowledge, and, of course, local production resilience. Trusting visible compliance as protection, well, that often failed under occupation regimes. Many families genuinely believed that strict obedience to occupation authorities would ensure their safety. This assumption was shaped by earlier conflicts, where civilian compliance did tend to reduce risk. But World War II, it really shattered that precedent. In Nazi-occupied territories, compliance did not prevent deportation, forced labor, or execution once policies shifted. And in Imperial Japan's occupied regions, cooperation offered no real protection against mass reprisals tied to military setbacks. Survivors often reported that invisibility, adaptability, and informal networks mattered far more than overt compliance. Blending in, limiting documentation, and maintaining multiple contingency identities, these became crucial survival strategies. These experiences, in turn, influenced Cold War-era resistance planning, which emphasized decentralized civilian resilience rather than faith in occupying administrations. Families often delayed hiding or dispersing because, honestly, separation felt worse than danger itself. The emotional bond of staying together proved fatal in many cases. Families resisted sending children away, splitting households, or hiding members separately because, well, separation felt like surrender. Yet in ghettos, occupied villages, and bombed cities, dispersal increased survival odds. Children evacuated early from London survived the Blitz in far greater numbers. Jewish families who sent children into hiding, despite unbearable uncertainty, had higher survival rates than those who stayed intact. Post-war humanitarian and evacuation planning increasingly recognized that emotional cohesion can sometimes conflict with physical survival. Modern crisis response frameworks explicitly address family separation planning because, World War II demonstrated that refusing to plan for it often resulted in total loss. Civilians underestimated the long-term danger of environmental contamination. World War II introduced civilians to hazards that were not immediately lethal but became deadly over time. Unexploded ordnance, contaminated water sources, burned industrial zones, and destroyed sanitation systems created invisible threats. Families returned to damaged homes too quickly, drank from compromised wells, or used debris-laden materials for rebuilding. The long-term death toll from disease, injury, and malnutrition linked to environmental damage rivaled direct combat casualties in some regions. These outcomes shaped post-war public health policy, leading to the integration of environmental risk assessment into civilian defense planning, disaster recovery, and refugee camp design. Many people believed the war would end before worst-case scenarios reached them. Perhaps the most common and tragic miscalculation was temporal optimism. Civilians repeatedly assumed that collapse would stop short of their town, their region, or their family. This belief delayed preparation, evacuation, and adaptation. By the time worst-case scenarios arrived, options had narrowed to none. This pattern appeared everywhere. French civilians in 1940, German families in 1944, Japanese urban populations in 1945. The lesson reshaped modern survival planning by emphasizing early action based on trajectory rather than proximity. Waiting for certainty proved incompatible with survival in total war. World War II did not only test armies, it tested civilian judgment under pressure. With incomplete information and no margin for error, the families who survived were not braver or smarter in any simple sense. They adapted earlier, accepted painful trade-offs, and recognized that familiar rules no longer applied. Remembering these lesser-known survival failures matters because they reveal how quickly human systems can fail and how preparation, flexibility, and hard choices shape outcomes more than hope or obedience ever did. If you value careful historical analysis that treats survival as a discipline rather than a myth, subscribe to the Survival Record, and share this video with others who want to understand history at its most human and instructive.